Amsterdam's streets hide something beneath them that shouldn't exist. When engineers began excavating for the city's north-south metro line in 2003, they expected old bottles, maybe some coins, the usual debris of urban history. What they found instead was nearly 700,000 artifacts buried in layers of mud so deep and so organized that the official timeline of the city started falling apart. Doors submerged 15 feet below street level. Windows that once opened to daylight now encased in sediment. Entire building facades swallowed by earth that wasn't supposed to be there. This wasn't gradual burial. This was something else. The mudflood theory claims a catastrophic event buried cities worldwide sometime in the 18th or 19th century, erasing an advanced civilization from history. Most dismiss it outright, but Amsterdam's excavation revealed something historians struggle to explain. Why are medieval structures buried so deep? Why does the architecture suggest multiple ground levels that contradict construction records? And why, when archaeologists drained sections of the old Amstel riverbed, did they find evidence of a city built on top of another city, with no clear explanation for what happened in between? Walk through Amsterdam's canal district today and you're strolling 6 to 10 feet above the original street level. The buildings you admire, those iconic narrow houses with their ornate gables, they're standing on wooden piles driven 40 feet into clay. But here's what doesn't add up. If you descend into the basements of these 17th century structures, you'll find doorways that lead nowhere, windows at floor level, architectural features that only make sense if the ground outside was once much lower. The official story calls this settling, compaction of marshy soil over centuries, except the math doesn't work. Historical records from the 1600s and 1700s show street levels that match today's measurements. The buildings haven't sunk. The ground rose. Something added all that earth. The Rokin metro station sits where Amsterdam's main harbour once thrived, a bustling inland port where merchants unloaded goods from ships that sailed the globe during the Dutch Golden Age. When construction crews carved out this station, they had to dig 25 meters down, deeper than anyone expected. At that depth, they hit layers of artifacts spanning thousands of years, compressed into strata that told a story of rapid burial, not gradual accumulation. Ceramics from 1450 mixed with objects from 1600, all sealed beneath mud layers thick enough to preserve them perfectly. The archaeological team found leather shoes, still recognizable after 400 years in the muck, glass bottles with their contents intact, wooden tools that should have rotted but didn't because they were buried so quickly, so completely, that oxygen never reached them. Every building along Amsterdam's famous canals rests on those wooden piles, some using timber from as far back as the 1300s. The engineering required to drive 12-meter poles through marsh into stable clay was sophisticated, even by modern standards. Yet we are told this was accomplished by workers with rope and pulley systems, no machinery, just human labor coordinating thousands of wooden foundations across an expanding city. The precision needed to keep these structures level, to ensure they wouldn't shift as the soft ground compressed, it suggests knowledge that doesn't quite fit the primitive construction methods described in historical accounts. And here's something nobody mentions in the tourism brochures. Many of these buildings have basement levels that were clearly designed as ground floors. Ornate tile work, decorative features, ceiling heights appropriate for main living spaces, all of it now underground. The metro excavation employed a technique called caisson construction, using pressurized concrete chambers to hold back water while workers dug beneath the city. The archaeological teams working inside these caissons had to acclimate in pressure chambers before entering, just like deep-sea divers, because the water pressure at those depths could kill them. They were literally working in an underwater environment, 20 meters below Amsterdam's streets, sifting through centuries of mud. And what they found wasn't a gradual layering of debris. It was compressed strata, distinct levels separated by thick bands of sediment that appeared deposited all at once. Geologists on the project noted this looked more like flood deposits than slow accumulation, but that observation didn't make it into the official reports. Amsterdam supposedly began as a small fishing village in the late 1200s, gradually expanding as merchants recognized the Amstel River's strategic position for trade. By the 1600s, during what historians call the Dutch Golden Age, the city exploded in wealth and size, constructing those famous concentric canals in an ambitious 50-year project. The story is neat, linear, progressive, but the physical evidence tells something different. The artifacts recovered from beneath Damrak Station, the northern terminus of the old Amstel Harbour, include objects that predate Amsterdam's official founding. Stone tools from 4300 BC. Bronze Age implements, Roman period artifacts, evidence of human activity going back to the last ice age 10,000 years ago. The city isn't built on virgin marshland. It's built on top of something older, something substantial enough to leave traces that deep. The official explanation for Amsterdam's buried architecture involves land reclamation, a process where the Dutch systematically raised ground levels using urban waste, dredging spoils, and construction rubble. Historical records from 1595 even document a city resolution ordering the use of refuse to create new land for expansion. This happened, no question. But it doesn't explain the depth of burial, the uniformity of the mud layers, or why so many buildings show evidence of multiple ground levels that don't align with documented construction dates. A 1595 land reclamation project doesn't account for structures buried under 15 feet of sediment showing architectural features from the 1400s. The timeline collapses under scrutiny. Here's where it gets stranger. The wooden piles supporting every canal-side building, those foundations driven deep into clay, they've been analyzed using dendrochronology, tree ring dating. Some of the timber comes from forests hundreds of miles away, transporting to Amsterdam during periods when the city supposedly lacked the infrastructure for such large-scale operations. The logistics of moving thousands of massive logs, shaping them, driving them precisely into marshy ground, all of it suggests an organizational capacity that doesn't match the small trading post described in early records. Unless Amsterdam inherited these foundations from whoever was here before, whoever built on this land before the mud came. The metro excavation revealed something else that doesn't fit neatly into accepted history. Beneath the layers of 17th and 18th century artifacts, beneath the medieval objects, there's a stratum of organic material, compressed peat mixed with clay, that shows signs of rapid deposition. Not gradual swamp formation, rapid burial. The sediment analysis indicates this layer formed quickly, possibly catastrophically, preserving whatever lay beneath it in an oxygen-deprived environment. That's why organic materials survived. That's why leather and wood from 600 years ago emerged intact when the archaeologists drained the old riverbed. They weren't protected by careful burial. They were sealed by something sudden, something that covered them before decay could begin. The mudflood theory suggests a worldwide cataclysm buried advanced civilizations beneath meters of sediment, and that modern cities were built on top of these ruins by survivors who either forgot or deliberately obscured what came before. It sounds absurd until you're standing in Rokin Station, looking at 10,000 artifacts pulled from beneath Amsterdam's streets, arranged by depth, showing clear evidence of multiple occupation layers separated by thick bands of mud. Until you examine the basement windows and buried doorways that appear throughout the canal district. Until you ask why historical records are so vague about Amsterdam's early construction methods, why the engineering seems too advanced for the era, why the foundations suggest planning on a scale that doesn't match a fishing village growing into a trading port. Something happened here. Something added all that earth, buried all those structures, reset the ground level across an entire city. And whatever it was, it happened fast enough to preserve artifacts perfectly, completely enough to bury architectural features that were clearly meant to be visible, and recently enough that we're still finding evidence everywhere we dig. The question isn't whether Amsterdam's streets hide something beneath them. The excavation proved they do. The question is what that something reveals about history we've been told versus history that actually happened. Look at the archaeological layers themselves. The metro excavation went down 25 meters below modern street level, deep enough to reach sediments from the last ice age. At those depths, they found mollusk shells dating back 115,000 years. But it's the middle layers that create problems for the official timeline. Between the Ice Age deposits and the medieval artifacts, there's a compressed stratum of organic material showing signs of rapid formation, not centuries of gradual accumulation. Rapid burial that preserved everything it touched. The archaeologists working in those pressurized caissons, risking decompression sickness to excavate beneath the water table, they documented something peculiar. The sediment layers don't show the gradual transitions you'd expect from natural swamp development. They show distinct boundaries, sharp transitions between different types of material, as if the earth itself was deposited in stages, in events, not through slow geological processes. And within those layers, artifacts from wildly different periods appear closer together than they should. A medieval coin sitting just inches above pottery shards that predate the city's founding by centuries. The official explanation claims these discrepancies result from centuries of dredging and canal construction, churning up the riverbed, mixing older materials with newer deposits. But that doesn't account for the preservation. When you disturb a riverbed, when you dredge and redistribute sediment, organic materials decay rapidly once exposed to oxygen. Yet the leather goods pulled from beneath Rokin Station emerged intact, stitching still visible, dyes still identifiable. The wooden artifacts showed minimal rot despite supposedly being submerged and redistributed multiple times over 6 centuries. They weren't preserved by being underwater. They were preserved by being buried quickly, sealed away from oxygen before decomposition could begin. Here's what the excavation revealed that nobody wants to discuss in detail. At Damrak Station, where an ancient bridge once connected the river's banks, the archaeological team found structural remains at 3 distinct levels. The uppermost level matches documented 16th century construction. The middle level shows building techniques from approximately the 1300s. But the lowest level, buried under meters of compacted sediment, displays masonry work that doesn't match any known Dutch building tradition from that era. The stonework is too precise, the mortar too advanced, the architectural planning too sophisticated for what should have been a small fishing settlement barely mentioned in regional records. The wooden piles supporting these structures tell a similar story. Dendrochronology dates them across a span of centuries, but here's the problem. Some of the timber comes from forests in regions that weren't connected to Amsterdam through documented trade routes during the periods when these piles were supposedly installed. The logistics of transporting massive logs hundreds of kilometers, then precisely driving them through marshy ground to bedrock, requires organizational infrastructure and engineering knowledge that doesn't align with a village of a few hundred people living in wooden houses. Unless someone else did the driving, unless Amsterdam's famous canal system was built on foundations that predated the Dutch Golden Age by centuries, foundations installed by a civilization that possessed the engineering capacity to work on this scale, then vanished, then was built over by survivors who either didn't understand what they'd inherited or chose not to explain it. Walk along the Herengracht today and count the basement windows sitting at ground level, not below ground, at ground level. Those aren't basements anymore. They're ground floors that got buried. The merchants who built those grand canal houses in the 1600s, they were constructing on top of something. The architectural plans from that era show building heights and proportions that suggest the architects expected different street levels than what exists now. Doorways that should open onto grand entrances instead open several feet above the sidewalk, requiring steep steps that weren't in the original designs. Windows that should provide street-level views instead peer down from elevated positions. The standard explanation claims this resulted from continuous efforts to raise the city above flood level, adding layer after layer of filled dirt over centuries. But the soil analysis contradicts this. The fill material beneath Amsterdam's streets isn't layered like you'd expect from gradual elevation increases. It's compressed, compacted, as if it arrived all at once and then settled under its own weight. That 2-meter compaction documented in the ordnance surveys, that's not the result of slow settlement over centuries. That's rapid compression, the kind that happens when massive amounts of material are deposited suddenly and then consolidate quickly. The artifacts themselves create another timeline problem. At Rockin Station, the display cases show objects arranged by depth and estimated date. Ceramics from 1450 to 1600 dominate the Damrak finds. Objects from 1650 to 1875 fill most of the Rockin collection, but scattered throughout, at depths that don't correspond to their supposed age, there are items that predate Amsterdam's documented founding. Not just a few anomalies, hundreds of objects. Stone tools from 4300 BCE, Roman period metalwork, early medieval coins from kingdoms that never officially traded with this region. The archaeologists catalogued these items, displayed them, then moved on without asking the obvious question. What were Roman artifacts doing beneath a city that supposedly didn't exist until 1,000 years after Rome fell? The answer in the museum placards suggests random deposition, objects that washed downstream from other locations and settled in the riverbed. But that explanation falls apart when you examine the concentration. These aren't scattered finds spread across kilometers of river. They're clustered in specific locations, in patterns that suggest settlement, not random accumulation. And then there's the construction technique itself, the thing that made Amsterdam possible, but that nobody can quite explain. Driving wooden piles through meters of soft peat and clay to reach solid ground requires precision engineering. Each pile must be placed exactly right, driven to exactly the correct depth, positioned to distribute weight evenly across unstable ground. The canal houses built in the 1600s required thousands of these piles, each one carefully installed before construction could begin. The official history credits Dutch engineers with developing this technique, perfecting it during the Golden Age. But the oldest structures in Amsterdam, the ones predating the canal ring construction, they sit on identical pile foundations. Same technique, same precision, same engineering principles. Either the Dutch perfected this method centuries before they supposedly invented it, or they inherited the technique from whoever was building here before them. The metro excavation found pile foundations beneath pile foundations in some locations, older structural elements buried under newer ones, suggesting multiple phases of construction using the same advanced methodology across spans of time that don't fit the accepted narrative. The 697,235 artifacts recovered from beneath Amsterdam's streets represent the largest urban archaeological excavation in Dutch history. They've been studied, catalogued, and displayed. They prove people have been living, working, and building in this location for thousands of years, longer than the official city founding in 1275. But they also prove something else. The gaps in the archaeological record, the missing centuries between major artifact clusters, the sudden appearance of advanced construction at depths that suggest earlier dates than documented history allows, all of it points toward events that reset this location multiple times. Events that buried what came before, that forced survivors to rebuild on top of ruins they might not have fully understood. Amsterdam's streets hide something most residents walk over daily without noticing: vault lights. Those thick glass blocks embedded in sidewalks throughout the old city center, usually dismissed as decorative elements or practical solutions for lighting basement storage areas. But look closer at where they appear and when they were installed, and a different picture emerges. The standard explanation says vault lights were invented in the late 1800s to illuminate cellars and basements in densely built urban areas where natural light couldn't reach below street level. Practical, efficient, unremarkable. Except Amsterdam's vault lights aren't just in commercial districts or warehouse areas. They're scattered throughout residential neighborhoods, appearing in locations where basement lighting serves no obvious commercial purpose. And they're positioned at depths that suggest the basements they illuminate weren't originally basements at all. Walk along Rockin today and you'll see them. Glass blocks set into the pavement, some original, some replacements, all marking spaces that exist below what we call ground level. The metro excavation revealed what lies beneath many of these vault lights: rooms. Complete rooms with finished walls, doorways, and architectural details that indicate they were designed as ground floor spaces, not subterranean storage. The pile compaction data tells you why. The soil underwent 2 meters of settling, while the buildings themselves, anchored on their 12-meter wooden piles, remained at their original height. That means Amsterdam's ground level rose 2 meters relative to the structures built upon it. What was once a ground floor entrance became a basement. What was once a street-level window became a cellar opening. And what was once open air became buried space, requiring vault lights to provide illumination. This wasn't a gradual process spanning centuries. The archaeological comparison between 17th-century ordnance, datum records, and modern measurements shows the compaction happened relatively quickly, within decades rather than generations. Buildings that were constructed with their first floors at street level found themselves sitting above a rising tide of fill material, urban waste, and deposited sediment that transformed the city's relationship to its own architecture. You can see the evidence in the canal houses themselves. Those famous Amsterdam facades with their distinctive gables and elaborate decorations. Look at where their ground floor entrances sit relative to the canal water level. Then look at the sealed doorways and bricked-up windows below them. Original entrances now submerged. Original windows now blocking nothing but earth and fill. The official narrative attributes this to intentional land-raising projects, which did occur. The 1595 City Resolution, documenting the creation of Vluyenburg Island, specifically ordered the use of city refuse as fill material. But that resolution came after the buildings were constructed, after the streets were laid, after the city had already established its ground level. It was a response to a problem, not the creation of one. What problem? Why would Amsterdam need to raise its land level after already building upon it? The usual answer points to flooding, to the constant battle against water that defined Dutch engineering. But the pile foundations already solved that problem. Those 12-meter wooden supports driven deep into solid ground beneath the peat and clay created stable platforms that didn't need additional elevation for structural integrity. Unless the water wasn't the only issue. Unless something else had deposited material across the city rapidly enough that building entrances became buried, that street levels rose faster than could be managed through normal urban development, that entire ground floors transformed into basements within a single generation's memory. The artifact layers support this reading. The metro excavation found clear stratification in some areas, distinct layers marking different periods of deposition. But in other locations, particularly around Damrak and Rokin, the stratigraphy shows mixed deposits, materials from different eras compressed together in ways that suggest rapid accumulation rather than slow layering over time. Archaeological standards call this a closed context, when it's intentional fill, material deliberately deposited to raise land. But closed contexts typically show consistent composition, uniform material types that indicate organized dumping. The Amsterdam deposits show heterogeneity, random mixtures of construction rubble, household waste, organic material, and sediment that look less like planned land reclamation and more like emergency burial of whatever was available. Then there's the question of the Roman artifacts and pre-medieval objects found at depths that place them chronologically after Amsterdam's documented founding. The museum explanation suggests river transport, items washing downstream from distant settlements and settling into the Amstel riverbed over centuries. But rivers don't concentrate artifacts, they disperse them. The patterns found beneath Rokin and Damrak show clustering, concentration, spatial relationships that indicate the objects were deposited where people were living and working, not where random currents happened to settle them. Cities across Europe show similar patterns. London's underground rivers and buried street levels. Dublin's medieval city discovered meters below modern pavement. Toronto's Old Town buried beneath Victorian-era fill. Each city explains it differently: intentional raising, flood management, urban renewal, but the architectural evidence repeats with uncomfortable consistency. Buildings designed for one ground level now sitting above another, doorways leading nowhere, windows opening into earth. Vault lights illuminating spaces that weren't supposed to need illumination. Amsterdam's canal ring construction began in 1613, the same period when land-raising projects became documented necessity rather than occasional practice. The three main canals took 50 years to complete, an enormous undertaking that transformed the city's size and layout. But here's what doesn't add up. The engineering required to dig those canals through peat and clay, to manage water flow, to prevent collapse, that same engineering should have been sophisticated enough to prevent the need for massive fill deposits to raise existing streets. Unless the canals weren't just transportation infrastructure. Unless they were also drainage systems responding to conditions that required rapid water management on a scale beyond normal urban planning. The concentric arc design, the way the canals connect to each other and to the Amstel, it creates a network capable of moving enormous volumes of water out of the city center quickly, not the slow flow of commercial barges. Fast drainage, emergency-level capacity. The wooden pile foundations underneath every canal house represent an engineering achievement that shouldn't have been necessary if Amsterdam's ground was stable and dry when construction began. Driving thousands of wooden supports 12 meters deep through soft earth to reach solid ground suggests the builders knew the surface level couldn't be trusted, that whatever they built needed to be anchored far below the visible ground plane. That's not standard construction. That's building on land you expect to become unstable, to shift, to change in ways that surface-level foundations can't accommodate. Which brings us back to those vault lights embedded in Amsterdam's sidewalks. They're not just lighting solutions, they're markers, evidence of a ground level that rose faster than buildings could adapt, that buried first floors and transformed the city's relationship to its own architecture within living memory of the people who built it. The glass blocks illuminate spaces that were never meant to be dark, preserve access to rooms that were never meant to be underground, and create a permanent record of Amsterdam's buried history that no official explanation has ever adequately addressed. What makes Amsterdam's situation different from typical flood management is the speed and scale. Official records document 4 major land-raising projects between the 16th and 17th centuries, massive undertakings that deposited layers of dredging spoils, peat sods, clay, urban waste, and construction rubble across the expanding city. The 1595 city resolution specifically ordered the use of refuse to create Villuyenburg Island, one of the few times such practices were formally documented. But archaeological evidence shows this wasn't exceptional planning. It was standard procedure across European cities during the same period, suggesting a coordinated response to conditions that required rapid ground-level adjustment on a continental scale. Here's where the engineering becomes impossible to reconcile with gradual urban development. Ordnance datum records from the 17th and 18th centuries show street levels remained constant, while the soil beneath underwent 2 meters of compaction. The houses built on 12-meter wooden piles didn't sink. The ground compressed around them. That means the fill material added during land-raising projects wasn't just surface-level cosmetic work. It was structural compensation for ground that was actively unstable, actively settling, actively changing in ways that required massive intervention just to maintain usable city space. Walk through Amsterdam's oldest neighborhoods today and you'll see buildings tilting at angles that shouldn't be survivable. Merchants' houses along the Herengracht lean forward, backward, sideways, their wooden pile foundations shifting incrementally as the compressed earth continues settling centuries after the original construction. The Dutch call them dancing houses, a charming nickname for what is actually ongoing structural failure. These aren't buildings settling naturally over time. These are structures responding to ground conditions that never fully stabilized, that continue moving, that suggest the earth beneath Amsterdam is still adjusting to whatever event required those emergency land-raising projects in the first place. The metro excavations between 2003 and 2012 gave archaeologists their first systematic look at what lies beneath modern Amsterdam, and what they found doesn't match the timeline we've been given. Digging down 30 meters at station sites like Rokin and Damrak, they recovered nearly 700,000 artifacts spanning from 115,000-year-old mollusk shells to 19th-century ceramics. But the distribution pattern creates problems. Medieval coins and worked stone from 4,300 BCE appear at depths that place them chronologically after the 13th century founding of Amsterdam. Roman period artifacts show up in soil layers dated to post-medieval times. The official explanation relies on river transport, suggesting these objects washed downstream from distant locations and settled randomly into the Amstel riverbed over millennia. Except rivers don't preserve spatial relationships. They scatter. They disperse. The artifact clusters found beneath Rokin and Damrak show organization, concentration, patterns indicating the objects were deposited where people lived and worked, not where random water currents happened to drop them. The archaeological team working in pressurized caissons 25 meters underground documented layer after layer of human activity, each one sealed beneath subsequent deposits of fill material, each one suggesting occupation levels that predate Amsterdam's documented history. What disturbs researchers most isn't finding old artifacts under an old city. It's finding architectural elements that don't correspond to any recorded construction period. Foundation stones cut with precision that exceeds 17th century Dutch capability. Drainage systems engineered for water flow volumes that merchant canal houses would never generate. Structural supports designed for weight loads that wooden buildings shouldn't require. All of it buried, all of it predating the official timeline, all of it suggesting Amsterdam wasn't built on virgin marshland, but on top of something that was already here. The vault lights become crucial evidence because they mark the transition point. They identify the exact moment when Amsterdam's relationship to its own ground level changed so dramatically that buildings needed permanent lighting solutions for spaces that were never meant to be dark. Glass block panels embedded in sidewalks across the canal district aren't decorative. They're functional adaptations to a city that rose too fast for its architecture to keep pace. First-floor windows that now open into earth. doorways that lead to buried rooms, staircases descending to levels that official records insist were always below grade. But were they? Compare photographs from the 1800s to modern street views and you'll see something unsettling. The proportions changed. Buildings that once had two visible stories above ground now show only one. Structures photographed with clearly defined ground floor entrances now have those same entrances half buried. The standard explanation cites ongoing settlement, gradual sinking, normal urban evolution. But the evidence shows something more abrupt, something that happened within living memory of the people who documented it, then stopped talking about it. Cities across Europe show identical patterns: London's underground rivers and buried Roman levels. Dublin's medieval city discovered meters below modern pavement. Toronto's old town submerged beneath Victorian fill. Each location offers different official explanations, but the architectural evidence remains consistent. Buildings designed for one ground level now existing at another. Infrastructure built for surface access now requiring excavation to reach. And everywhere the same solution: vault lights, glass blocks, pavement panels. Architectural adaptations that preserve access to spaces the official timeline insists were always underground. What if the timeline is wrong? Not by centuries, by decades. What if something happened in the 1700s and 1800s that required rapid ground level adjustment across multiple cities simultaneously? Something that filled basements, buried first floors, and forced entire urban populations to adapt their architecture to a new relationship with the earth beneath them. The wooden piles driven 12 meters deep under every Amsterdam canal house weren't precautionary engineering. They were emergency response. Building foundations designed to remain stable when the ground around them couldn't be trusted, when surface-level construction would fail, when the only solid footing existed far below the visible earth. The vault lights preserve what written records deliberately obscure. They mark the buried city, the previous ground level, the Amsterdam that existed before the raising projects transformed it into something else. Stand on any canal bridge and look down at the sidewalks below. Those glass panels aren't lighting cellars. They're illuminating the first floor of a city we've been taught never existed at the elevation where it actually stood. The evidence remains visible because removing it would require demolishing the infrastructure we've built on top of it. So instead, we've rewritten the narrative. We've called it urban planning, flood management, land reclamation. We've turned emergency response into intentional design and buried history into architectural evolution. But the vault lights remember. Every glass panel marks a space that shouldn't need illumination, preserves access to rooms that official records claim were always below ground, and creates a permanent record of the moment Amsterdam's relationship to its own surface changed so dramatically that the only solution was to build upward and pretend the buried city beneath had always been there. The question isn't whether Amsterdam rose. The evidence proves it did. The question is why we've spent centuries pretending it didn't. The metro excavations that tore through Amsterdam between 2003 and 2012 weren't supposed to prove anything controversial. They were infrastructure projects with archaeological oversight, routine documentation of what lies beneath a historic city. But nearly 700,000 artifacts later, after years of working in pressurized chambers 25 meters underground, after cataloging objects that span from the Ice Age to the Industrial Revolution, the official story started showing cracks it couldn't repair. Those vault lights embedded in sidewalks across the canal district aren't charming historical details. They're evidence. Markers of a ground level that rose so rapidly, so dramatically, that entire first floors became basements within decades. Buildings constructed with street-level entrances that now open onto buried rooms. Windows designed to admit daylight that now illuminate spaces through thick glass panels because they're 6 feet underground. Amsterdam didn't gradually settle over centuries. The ordnance datum records prove the buildings stayed level while the earth around them compressed 2 meters. The wooden piles driven 12 meters deep weren't innovative engineering. They were necessary survival, foundations anchored far below a surface that couldn't be trusted because something had already demonstrated it would change, would rise, would bury whatever wasn't secured to bedrock. The artifacts tell you what happened even when the records stay silent. Roman objects beneath a city that supposedly didn't exist when Rome fell. Medieval structures buried under sediment that arrived too quickly to allow gradual accumulation. Construction techniques too advanced for the fishing village timeline. And everywhere, those pressurized layers of organic material preserved perfectly because they were sealed away from oxygen before decay could begin. That's not land reclamation. That's burial. And those 4 documented land-raising projects between the 16th and 17th centuries weren't ambitious urban planning. They were emergency response to conditions that had already transformed the city's relationship to its own ground, that had already forced populations to adapt or abandon, that had already demonstrated the surface level itself was negotiable in ways that required massive intervention just to maintain inhabitable space. The mudflood theory asks what happened to bury cities worldwide in the 18th and 19th centuries. Amsterdam's excavations don't answer that question definitively. But they prove something did happen, something rapid enough to preserve leather and wood, something comprehensive enough to affect entire urban centers, something recent enough that we are still building on top of it, while pretending the buried levels beneath were always meant to be underground. Every vault light marking Amsterdam's sidewalks illuminates a space that remembers when it wasn't dark, wasn't buried, wasn't forgotten. The glass panels preserve what the historical record deliberately obscures, create permanent evidence of the city that existed before the earth rose to swallow it, and mark the exact moment when Amsterdam's architects realized they couldn't build down anymore. They could only build up and hope the foundations held. The question was never whether Amsterdam hides something beneath its streets. The excavations proved it does. The question is whether we are ready to acknowledge what that something reveals about the history we've agreed to accept versus the history the earth itself refuses to forget.